Hi everyone, welcome back to the course on Sociology of Media and Communication. So, today is the third lecture and I am going to continue our discussion on the public sphere and counterpublics. In the previous lecture, I introduced the concept of public sphere to you along with Nancy Fraser's critique which she calls the counterpublic or something which can also be known as an alternative public. So, in today's lecture, we are going to dive deeper into the details of these concepts and the rise of modern forms of media and communication, especially keeping in mind the Indian context. So, when we look at the Indian context, in the previous class, I was talking about the pre-independence context and the development of a public sphere, how the ideas of public is also heterogeneous, primarily owing to the country's diversity in terms of region, language and other social identities. Now, this is also the era in which there is a redefinition of ideas of what the modern and the traditional mean in colonial India, which also continues to post-colonial India. So, there are also redefinitions of the ideas of what the middle class means. There is an emergence of the rise of the new middle class, and what has also happened is that there is a lot of scholarly discussion on what this middle classness is. Now, middle classness is a moral and ethical assertion of being a specific kind of person. This claim is made by many sections of the Indian population cutting across income and wealth categories. So, there is no particular homogeneous definition of being a middle class person in the Indian context, and economically, while your income and wealth may vary, there are also social and moral claims to being the middle class. Usage of old assets like power and privilege along with new ideas of socio-political organization, constructing notions of the modern and the developed become a part of how you become a middle class person. There is a clear emulation of Western lifestyle and assertion of power. Now, to be middle class is not just to have a particular kind of income, it is also to have a particular kind of taste, a particular kind of social and cultural capital, as French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu would argue. Interestingly, these middle classness and ideas are part of what the colonial project of a westernization as well as modernity would be. Now, when we think about the middle class, this is also seen as a class which is enterprising in nature and possesses this idea of merit. So, in post-independent India, when we think about the middle class, it is also the flag bearer of an enterprise culture which treats characteristics like self-reliance, motivation, hard work, merit, etc. as very, very important to being a middle class. This particular group of people also looks at individual agency as central to the culture of being middle class, where categories of caste, class, gender, religion, the so-called traditional identities are not viewed as barriers to success. So, essentially what it means is that if you are a middle class person, you have individual merit and potential defining you, and your social identity by virtue of being a middle class person enables you to then achieve what you want to. Merit is a very, very significant part of the discourse on the middle class identity, and majority of the middle class have been members of in the intelligentsia, bureaucracy and other recognized independent professions in imperial India. So, there is also a generational kind of connectivity between who the middle class were and then who the middle class is in post-independent India. They were products of the colonial English education system while also carrying a feeling of historical denial with them. It is very, very significant that we think about historical denial here, essentially primarily because when we think about, let us say, the historical denial, it means that we are also dealing with an idea of being deprived because of how colonial rule was imposed on us, but at the same time, it is also crucial that we think about the middle class as beneficiaries of English and Western education. Now, this middle class is very important to how we think about the public sphere. The ideas of the public and the public sphere have been central to modern democratic theory, as we discussed in the previous class as well. And thinker C. Wright Mills suggests that a community of publics exists when individuals can take part in political and social debate as well as action. A public also leads to a form of communication that permits instant and useful feedback, and people who have the means to communicate with each other in a relatively unrestricted manner. When one thinks about the middle class and forms of media and communication, these characteristics of the public are very important. Now, we had discussed that German thinker Jürgen Habermas builds on the idea of the public further and understands the public in bourgeois society and how it has structurally transformed over the years. He looks at public events as open to all, unlike what would be restrictive private affairs. Habermas also develops a historical understanding of the modern category of what publicness means, and this liberal public sphere, which is an in-between arena between the civil society and the state, actually also develops in the backdrop of a market economy which is in development, and this is where the middle class's role is very important. Individuals in Habermas's modern bourgeois public sphere are primarily formed in the private sphere, which includes the family. So, the family plays a very crucial role in forming the individual, who then goes on into the public sphere. The demarcation of the public and the private is associated with how modern state and economy have advanced. So, he clearly asserts that his idea of public sphere is based on a particular kind of Western society. This public sphere exerts influence on the state even though it exists outside of state institutions, and I gave several examples in the previous class illustrating how, for instance, women's groups have exercised power, influence on the state to implement certain policies, etc. The public-private distinction arose with early capitalism itself, aided by the development of middle class and modern markers of identity like the press, journals, growth of coffee houses, salons, etc. The public sphere therefore can be defined as a shared space which is accessible to all, but there is also scrutinization of state's power which replaces the rulers or the monarch's absolute power as it has historically existed. Now, public opinion, which is about debates and deliberations among citizens, primarily necessitate and facilitate the state's accountability to the people, and therefore, it is not a static conceptual category, but also a moment of transition where we are looking at democratic governance, and there is deliberation of everyday affairs and established grounds of broad communication. The public sphere is a place for the formation and distribution of ideas and debates that may critique the state, as Nancy Fraser would argue. We had also discussed how Habermas's conceptualization has been critiqued as urban or town centric, limited to the middle class, mostly men from these classes. In the Indian context, there is a direct relationship between the individual and the state, which is possible in the Western context, but not in the Indian context, because we had colonial rule. And one can also see that the evolution of the public is different from how Habermas conceptualized it. So, in the Indian public sphere, initially we had a predominant role played by the Indian freedom movement, which carried forth the public opinion, and one could also see that pressing national and political issues were part of this public sphere, and it was very heterogeneous in character. Now, essentially one sees the emergence of public arenas, right, instead of a very homogeneous concrete public sphere, because of how regional and culturally diverse the country is. The term public sphere in this case can be described as a politically autonomous arena which was accessible to different sections of society. Now, because we are talking in depth about the Indian context, I must also mention how regional newspapers and theatres have played a very crucial role in the diversity of this public sphere. So, this public sphere was not only about reading and the press alone, as we will discuss throughout this course. It is also about other forms of media, alternate forms of media. So, one could see, for instance, that every region, including regions like Bengal, Assam, etc., had different kinds of regional resistance to the colonial government. For instance, Neeladarpana, based on the Indigo Revolt of 1859 to 60, a play was staged multiple times which raised serious questions about the colonial government. While there was censorship, and censorship was primarily possible in the English medium press, to control the vernacular press it was difficult for the government, primarily also because of how they could not understand everything. Now, interestingly, theatre and other forms of arts were also part of censorship. For instance, there was an emergency ordinance of 1876, Regulation of Theatre Performances and Dramatic Performances Act, implemented in 1879, which controlled what the British government would see as seditious activities. But what you can see is that the public sphere was very contested, primarily through negotiations and also different kinds of rivalries and social relations among different communities. So, the Indian public sphere in the colonial period was not a homogeneous, consensual and unitary space, instead it was segmented. So, formation of a universal bourgeois public sphere was difficult in India, and there were multiple competing public arenas working simultaneously, which continue to exist in that time as well as today. Therefore, public space or public sphere is very much a historical category, which is dependent on geography, history and time, and it cannot be understood in isolation. The Indian public sphere was fractured and heterogeneous as compared to the Western one. The modern Indian public sphere does not exactly replicate any version of the Western public sphere, including the Habermasian model. Now, the relationship between the public sphere and media continue to remain very important, and this is where our course is also trying to make sense of this relationship. So, the media plays a major role in how Habermas understands the development of the public sphere. So, there were shifts in the role of the media, where media has evolved now into an entity that commodifies news, becoming more interested in people as consumers than as citizens. However, when media initially started, that was not the case. To understand this relationship in a nuanced manner, let us also talk about the first phase of capitalism, where news also started to be traded along with commodities. In a way, in a capitalist society, everything becomes a commodity, and news is also part of that process. So, market oriented calculations for merchants required frequent and exact information about distant events. In the previous lecture, I had mentioned how the mercantile class or the traders play a crucial role in the development of the public sphere by circulating information and news. So, this is where their role is very significant. Then one can see the beginning of mail services, delivery of letters, which made regular communication possible between merchants and traders, and there was also in that sense a restriction on how information was circulated, because this was inaccessible to outsiders. But in gradual stages of capitalism, one can see that information becomes more democratic and accessible. So, in the mercantilist phase of capitalism, there is emergence also of political journals, which are controlled by merchants and the state and needed approval before publishing information. What kind of information was available in these journals? Well, this information were truncated versions of the already available information on recent events. Now, when one goes from this mercantilist phase to the booming capitalist mode of production, 17th century onwards, there is elimination of censorship and a new stage of development of public sphere, coinciding with the rise of democratic societies. There is influx of rational, critical arguments into the press, allowing the press to bring political decisions before a new kind of public forum. The press, which is also the fourth estate, could be openly critical of the state and get the people and the public to be involved in political debates. There also started regular supply of news which was publicly accessible. In the Indian context, in this period, there was significant number of periodicals and newspapers in circulation by the end of the 19th century, which was also a new way of forming public opinion. There was a practice of making information public which began with the growth of the press. So, heads of governments would communicate with the public through the press, be it the radio or the television later on. Colonial governments, particularly the British in India, used the press to express their views on administration and finance, and also to facilitate the creation of native subjects who they would be routinely censoring to censorship, as well as basically surveil the content and control how their subjects, which would be Indians in this context, behave. The censorship of the English press was easier, as we had discussed, than the regional press, because of how English was also their language, but we had vernacular languages. And what they also did was appoint translators to keep a check on regional newspapers. The heterogeneity of the regional press, for instance, Muslims had their own papers and periodicals like the Labour Chronicle, many caste groups had their own papers, many regions had their own periodicals, etc., made censorship difficult, but it also illustrated the diversity of the Indian public sphere. Now, the press here takes on the function of engaging citizens in rational and critical debate in both Western Europe and India, and you see that the newspaper is actually a site of persuasion and the production of agreement. So, here let me invoke Benedict Anderson's idea of imagined community and the idea of reading newspapers facilitated through what he calls print capitalism, that creates a sense of belonging among people who were reading the same news. Now, that also has a very specific impact on the way that nationalism, nation state, etc., are modern ideas. There is an expanded scope of information, news and other kinds of developments which went way beyond local developments. When we discuss television and other forms of subsequent media, we will see how the network of the global and what is possible to be known and heard has been further expanded. So, the local press in many ways also acts as a link between the government and the national press, because you have a mediating agency. So, what one observes is that there is a change in the way that this public sphere is evolving, and in the 20th century, with capitalism on the rise, the role of the press and media further changes. So, what Mills argues is that there is a transition from community of publics to mass society, which is that citizens actively participated in socio-political debates and now they become passive recipients. This is also something which Habermas talks about in terms of how there is a transformation of the citizenship. So, the middle class that I was talking about earlier in the lecture primarily becomes passive consumers. So, there is not much critical rational engagement anymore. This mass society, and as we will later see, the neo-Marxist theoretical perspective in the Frankfurt School also talks in terms of how it enables capitalist production of media and communication. So, in the mass society, most people are able to primarily engage with the content, but it also sort of makes us question if they can give the opinion that is required, which is critical. Interestingly, therefore, one can see that with the evolution of capitalistic processes, etc., there is also a transformation of the public sphere. So, the shift is from a critical public reflecting on its own culture to the one that merely consumes information. This shift is very much visible in the commercialization, where we have masses paying for content, and there is a creation of a mass press which loses its political nature, and also there is a commercially nurtured approach. So, one look at media today exemplifies this theoretical understanding, primarily because we see that there is a commercialization of media. So, the firm distinction between the public and private realms is replaced by a public sphere which is dominated by the mass media, and public life is effectively depoliticized. So, what is happening is that instead of politicizing, there is depoliticization. The relationship between mass media and commercialization, when we talk about consumerism, is very, very important, because now electronic media, as well as we discuss the public sphere more, gets heavily commercialized. There is focus on sensationalism and entertainment for TRPs. It increases prominence also of indigenous media with the growth of privately owned media. This is also something which could be seen as a positive impact, that you now have more diversity, you have more local, you have indigenous media, but at the same time they are also commercialized. For instance, Assam is one of the states with the highest number of news channels in a vernacular language, Assamese, but at the same time these news channels are also engaging in sensationalism and consumerism. Now, the transformation in the role of the media from being a pillar of democracy to creating consumers and spreading sensationalism is actually a big part of how the liberal public sphere is constructed, where the ideological content of media, the membership and interactive forms of publicness have led to a structural transformation of the public sphere. So, the ideological role of media is primarily also to legitimize neoliberal capitalist ideas. So, in a way, mass media has not been able to perform the role of scrutinizing the state and maintaining stable democracies. Decisions based on manipulations and deals are taking place instead of discussions and debates. Now, when we think about this public sphere, Robin Jeffries' study of 3 stages of print media, in which media is still evolving in a country like India, talks about rare, elite and mass forms of media. Now, primarily he says that the impact of mass media or media significantly reduces in the last stage, where it becomes pro-state and fails to mobilize public opinion. In the first stage, it serves national interests, but in the last phase, it actually becomes a tool for the promotion of the ideologies of the state. So, one can see that the public sphere has transformed globally and historically from serving a national interest to primarily serving ideological functions of the state. So, one can actually see that with the structural transformation of the public sphere globally and historically, media has become a means of generating excitement and sensationalism. And what one can also see is media houses having vested interests, where they seek to protect and promote their own interests. So, Noam Chomsky, in his study of manufacturing dissent, looks at the nexus between politics and business in his example of the media houses, where he suggests that the propaganda model that is created in the media is primarily because of the nexus between the two. Now, essentially the local press and media also has succumbed to the pressure of consumerism, because media houses become industries which also need to make profit. Now, let us also talk a little bit about Hindi newspapers, who have been heralded as harbingers of material change. By the turn of the 21st century, they also started featuring color supplements, marketing coupons and advertisements. Diversified content was a strategy to basically include sports, Bollywood and other news, which could attract viewers and readers. This new rebranded newspaper was aimed at both rural and urban audiences in different parts of India. For instance, in Assam, for instance, you would find different kinds of magazines targeted to housewives, you would find different kinds of magazines targeted to students, to government exam aspirants, etc. And these are all part of the public sphere, where there is also an idea of consumerism behind making the content. The media plays a significant role in refashioning India's public discourse, where consumerism is desirable. Maitri Chaudhary looks at this transformation of the media, particularly in relation to the question of gender, and we will talk about it in detail later in this course. So, what is happening is that while Habermas's public sphere ended feudal rule, there is a refeudalization of the public sphere, where there is an interconnectedness of the state, capitalism and media. If you recall, the beginning of the public sphere was actually at a point where it was an in-between arena between the state and civil society. And in this context, what has instead happened is that there is an interconnectedness. So, mainstream media becomes the tool of the dominant and the privileged, and this is unfortunately a global phenomena. Which is why when we think about counterpublics, this sort of provides us an alternative way to think about the public. So, we had discussed in the previous two classes that Habermas's idea of the public sphere was mostly male, urban, literate and educated. The poor and women amongst others were not a part of it. Leftist thinkers have criticized Habermas for solely focusing on what they would see as the bourgeois public sphere and for overstressing its importance in the democratic process. They feel that this idea of the public sphere does not recognize the role of power and the hierarchical relations in decision making. So, who is a part of that public sphere is not a coincidental idea, but instead guided by their social privileges and positions. Habermas relies on an extremely narrow idea of culture and identity, where there is an absence of nationalism and religion, and many ideas of diversity are missing from his conceptualization of the public sphere. For instance, deliberations in the Assamese public sphere have been influenced by ideas of cultural identity during both pre and post independence. If one takes the example of mobile theatre in Assam, it is an expression of Assamese identity and culture, which comments also on the discourse on language and region. Now, when we think about the counterpublic, it is actually an expanded notion of thinking about the public sphere as we have been discussing. Nancy Fraser argues that Habermas idealizes the liberal bourgeois public sphere and ignores other public spheres. So, the existence of a host of competing counterpublics, which could be the nationalist publics, the popular peasant publics, the elite women's publics and working class publics, they are ignored by Habermas, but these are also all equally important. Multiple competing publics and a hierarchical structure within which relationships function was also not taken into account. So, counterpublics disputed the exclusionary nature of the bourgeois public sphere and looked at marginalized social groups having their own sites and rituals of resistance. This public sphere has been productively pluralized by the idea of the alternative public spheres, which could also be called the subaltern counterpublics and counterpublics. When we think about subaltern publics, they are always in parallel conversational spheres where subordinated groups circulate counter discourses to reinterpret their identities, interests and needs. For instance, let us take an example from the Indian nationalist movement. So, during the British rule, while the British historical version would focus on how their rule was a tool to civilize Indians and colonial subjects, the representations on that side would talk about the positives of colonial rule. Different kinds of public spheres, all alternative, all counterpublics in India from varied regions would also present their counter discourses, which would suggest that the colonial rule was not so great as it was claimed. So, in that sense there is a diversity. So, more attention to unpublished writings, spoken languages, visual symbols and performative rituals are given. Oral histories are also considered to be a part of that alternative public sphere. So, the counterpublic spheres are spaces of self-understanding for communities. They signify resistance to the dominant culture and can address both micro and macro oppressions. They also illuminate the differential power relations among diverse publics. This means that while there are competing and multiple publics existing, the relationship between them is unequal. So, the English press, when it coexists with vernacular presses, have a more dominating influence. So, what we also see is when we use a lens of multiple publics or counterpublics is differential power relations, the social relations. We also see how the local context helps explain the production, circulation and reception of literature, especially in frontier regions of India. For instance, when we think about borderlands, and there is now also a lot of research on borderlands, you see that the margins, the borders, they have their own stories which bring the local into context when we are also talking about the national. So, this paradoxical relationship that exists between the regional and the national framework is explored through the idea of the counterpublic. So, please remember students that not all counterpublics are equal and they may not proceed from the same conditions of subalternity or marginality, but they definitely coexist. Now, while they were suppressed by the British, the upper caste male public spheres had a better chance of communicating and making their voices heard, primarily because they had more social historical privilege. So, the competing public spheres are then also not egalitarian in nature. Now, when we think about hierarchical societies, the subaltern counterpublics have a competing relationship with the dominant publics. The privileged groups are better positioned to acquire oratory and communication skills which help them engage in dialogue or debate within the public sphere. So, if one is historically privileged and have had a fairly okay life condition, the possibility of engaging in public discussions, forming a public sphere, that becomes more. Protocols and regulations which govern interactions within the public spheres are also unequal. For instance, when we think about institutions and especially elite institutions, they will have certain protocols and regulations which indicate how people who belong to them are supposed to behave. That is also reflected in how the public sphere that they are a part of is formed. Unequal counterpublic spheres exist in terms of language, access to resources and social hierarchy. So, one can also say that while we are focusing on these coexistence of alternative publics, it would be very misleading to think that these publics exist autonomously. They are actually in a relation of subalternity with each other. What this means is that while there are multiple counterpublics like I have illustrated, there exist these social relations of domination, hierarchy, inequality amongst them. Now, there is also a concept of the split public which is important in the Indian context, which Arvind Rajagopal talks about. He says that the split public is indicative of the friction that exists between the realms, which is joined through the media, where you see political discourse taking place through structured misapprehensions and also inhabited by different languages of politics. What this means is that the public sphere itself is split in multiple ways, and there is friction between those, and the media also plays a crucial role. So, there could be multiple public spheres, multiple forms of media and communication, and they would be circulating multiple kinds of information, all coexisting in their own universes. Now, when we think about digital media entering into these different public arenas, the concept of the public becomes contested again. So, when we are thinking about, let us say, the public sphere in this context, where we also have digital media and the possibility of generating content from the margins far beyond what was possible through the printing press and the television, one can actually see that when the diversity question is asked, that there is more diverse content on the internet. It is possible to bring in different kinds of ideas, but it also means that we are again asking what the public is, what the public sphere is. Now, when one thinks about, let us say, a YouTube video and the comments on the video, the question that we can ask is, are these comments of the people who are watching this video part of what would Habermas or Fraser understand as the public sphere? If the public sphere meant rational critical debate in which you were thinking about political questions, does this reflect what would be a public sphere? So, therefore, I would actually urge you to think about the public in this context when we are also thinking about, let us say, the pervasive presence of how the digital media itself is also interconnected in terms of how we are understanding what this public is. So, we have been discussing the structural transformation of the public sphere, and this is where the understanding of its implications on forms of media and communication become important. So, I would like to wind up this lecture on this reflection, which we will continue in the next one when we think about how this transformation has then led to emergence of media cultures which could be popular and more mass in nature. Thank you.